6 1/2. Caitlin, a 104C forward double somersault, tuck, 2.2. Awards. 5 1/2, 4, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4, 4 1/2, 5. Maya, a 302C, reverse one somersault, tuck, 1.6. Awards. 5, 5 1/2, 4 1/2, 5, 5, 5 1/2, 4 1/2. Mahana, a 103C, forward 1 1/2 somersaults, tuck, 1.6. Awards. 6, 6, 5 1/2, 6 1/2, 6, 5 1/2, 6 1/2. Lauren, a 401B, inward dive, pike, 1.5. Awards. 6 1/2, 7 1/2, 8, 7 1/2, 8, 7, 7 1/2. Alicia, 5122D, forward 1 somersault, 1 full twist, free position, 1.9. Awards. 4, 3 1/2, 6, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4. Ashley, a 5221D, back 1 somersault, 1 half twist, free position, 1.7. Awards. 4, 4 1/2, 6, 5 1/2, 5, 5, 4 1/2. Kylie, a 301A, reverse dive straight, 1.8. Awards. 5 1/2, 5, 5, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4, 4 1/2. Brianna, 202A, back 1 somersault straight, 1.7. Awards. 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 5 1/2, 5, 4 1/2, 4, 5. Caitlin, 103B, forward 1 1/2 somersaults, pike, 1.7. Awards. 6, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6, 6, 6 1/2. Jill's third dive is a 5132D. Forward 1 1/2 somersaults, 1 full twist. Free position, 2.2. Awards. 4 1/2, 3, 4 1/2, 3 1/2, 3 1/2, 3 1/2, 3 1/2. Mina 401B inward dive pike, 1.5. Judges awards. 7 1/2, 6 1/2, 7, 7, 6 1/2, 7, 7. Marissa, a 5122D, forward 1 somersault, 1 full twist, free 1.9. Awards. 4, 4, 4, 3 1/2, 3, 3 1/2, 4. Natalie, a 103C, forward 1 1/2 somersaults tuck, 1.6. Awards. 4, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4, 4 1/2. Emma, a 303C, reverse 1 1/2 somersaults tuck, difficulty 2.1. Awards. 5 1/2, 4 1/2, 5, 5, 4, 5 1/2, 4 1/2. Kaylee, 301A, reverse dive, straight 1.8. I'm sorry, third dive is a 202A, back 1 somersault, straight. Awards. 5, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 5 1/2, 5, 5, 5. Beginning the 4th of 5 rounds. Elena, 202A, back 1 somersault straight, 1.7. Awards. 6 1/2, 5 1/2, 6, 6 1/2, 7, 6 1/2, 6. Kayla, 301C, reverse dive, tuck, 1.6.
Good push and toe points and commit to your stretch on the bottom.
Awards. 7, 6, 6, 6, 6 1/2, 6, 6 1/2. Shan, 202A, back 1 somersault straight, 1.7. Awards. 6 1/2, 6, 6 1/2, 6, 6 1/2, 6, 6 1/2. Skylar, a 402C, inward 1 somersault, tuck, 1.6. Awards. 5 1/2, 6, 6, 6 1/2, 6, 6, 6. Nicole, a 403C, inward 1 1/2 somersaults, tuck 2.2. Awards. 5, 5, 5, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 5. Caitlin, a 5-2-2-2-D, back 1 somersault, 1 twist, free position, 1.9. Judges' awards.
Stand up and get your good push. Commit to your stretch.
5 1/2, 4, 5 1/2, 5, 5 1/2, 5, 6. Maya, a 301B, reverse dive pike, 1.7. We're going to do the scores one more time in that last dive. Please hold. 5 1/2, 4, 5 1/2, 5, 5 1/2, 5, 6. Yes. Please stand by.
There's people walking back and forth. Seems like that's what I can see where that could be a distraction, but that's so far away. But hopefully it shouldn't be. But how to play the standings, now like it's about dive work or not. Looking through the script. Something. It's like I can't get off the board because they told me to get off the board. I want to get off the board, but
Thank you for your patience, Maya. Maya's doing a 301B, reverse dive pike, difficulty 1.7. Awards. 4 1/2, 6, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6, 6, 4 1/2. Mahana, 401B, inward dive, pike 1.5. Awards. 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6 1/2, 6, 5 1/2, 6 1/2.
Funniest thing is during that break is when the wind is with the comments.
Lauren, 103B, forward 1 1/2 somersaults, pike 1.7. Awards. 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6, 6, 6, 5 1/2, 6. Alicia, 301C, reverse dive, tuck 1.6. Awards. 5, 5, 5 1/2, 5, 5, 5 1/2, 6. Ashley, a 102B, forward 1 somersault, pike 1.5. Awards. 4 1/2, 4, 4 1/2, 4, 5, 4, 5. Kylie, a 203C, back 1 1/2 somersaults, tuck 2.0. Awards. 4 1/2, 5, 4, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 5. Brian, a 301A, reverse dive straight 1.8. Awards. 5 1/2, 5, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 4 1/2. Caitlin, a 104C, forward double somersault, tuck 2.2. Awards. 4 1/2, 3, 4, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 4, 5. Jill, a 302C, reverse 1 somersault, tuck 1.6. Awards. 5 1/2, 5, 5 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 5, 5. Mina, a 402C, inward 1 somersault, tuck 1.6. Awards. 5 1/2, 5, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6, 6, 6. Marissa, a 103B, forward 1 1/2 somersaults, pike 1.7. Awards. 6, 6, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 5 1/2, 6. Natalie, a 301C, reverse dive, tuck 1.6. Awards. 4 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6, 6, 5 1/2, 5. Emma, a 203C, back 1 1/2 somersaults tuck, 2.0. Awards. 4, 5 1/2, 4, 5, 5, 5 1/2, 5. Kaylee, a 301A, reverse dive straight, 1.8. Awards. 3 1/2, 4 1/2, 3 1/2, 4 1/2, 4 1/2, 3 1/2, 4 1/2. Beginning the 5th round of the preliminaries. After this, we'll be cutting to the top 12 divers. Elena performing a 5-2-2-1-D. Back 1 somersault, 1 half twist, free position, 1.7. Awards. 6, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 7, 6 1/2, 7, 6 1/2. Kayla, 302C, reverse 1 somersault tuck, 1.6. Awards. 6, 5, 6, 6, 6, 6, 5 1/2. Shan, 5-2-2-3-D, back 1 somersault, 1 1/2 twist, free position, 2.3. Awards. 5, 5 1/2, 6, 5, 5 1/2, 5, 6 1/2. Skylar, a 403C, inward, 1 1/2 somersaults, tuck, 2.2. Awards. 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 7, 6 1/2, 6 1/2, 6 1/2. Nicole, a 201A, back dive straight, 1.7. Awards. 5, 5 1/2, 5, 5, 5, 5, 6. Caitlin, 5-2-2-3-D. Back 1 somersault, 1 1/2 twist. Free position, 2.3. Awards. 4 and 1/2,
Good hurdle
5,
bounce, push.
6 and 1/2, 6, 5 and 1/2, 5 and 1/2, 5 and 1/2. Maya, 5122D, forward 1 somersault, 1 full twist, free position, 1.9. Awards: 5 and 1/2, 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 6, 5 and 1/2. Mahana, 403C, inward 1 and 1/2 somersaults, tuck 2.2.